I love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. 'Cause all my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire, and in darkest night, you are close like no other. I've known you as a father, I've known you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. Hey! 'Cause all my life you have been faithful. Oh yes, you have. And all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything, oh Lord. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after, oh yeah, it's running after me. Oh yeah, your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I'm gonna sing of the goodness of God. I'm gonna sing. All my life you have been faithful. All of my life you've been faithful. All my life you have been so good. So good with every breath that I am able. Every breath I'm able, I'm gonna sing of the goodness of God. Yes, I am. Of the goodness of God. Oh, I'm gonna sing of the goodness of
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
Good afternoon and happy Sabbath, everyone. On behalf of the Health Ministries team, I'd like to welcome you all to our afternoon programme. This is part one of a 3-part mental health awareness series. The programme today will be looking at the impact of childhood trauma on mental health. Afternoon, all the way from Wales, will be leading in a presentation for us. I'm encouraging you all to interact in the chat and post any questions you've got in there, and hopefully at the end ask a few questions and just have a conversation after. But for now, I'll pass on to Joanna.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. This is a new platform for me. I've never used it before, so I hope I can. Please let me know if you can hear me. I'm hoping there's a chat option that I can know I'm heard. So, as the lady said, my name is Joanna Daniel, and I'm a trauma-informed counselor, and I work with adult survivors of childhood trauma and women who experience abuse. And we do that through our one-to-one counseling. We do retreats and conferences. That video that was just on was beautiful and really gives us an understanding of the impact of childhood trauma. So this week, my sister and I were having a conversation about forgiveness, as we like to do. And we were talking about forgiveness and abuse. And she wanted to know if a victim speaks to the abuser, so somebody who experienced abuse in their childhood, if they speak to the abuser and the abuser asks for forgiveness and kind of own what they've done, if that will alleviate the feelings and triggers. And I said, receiving an apology goes a long way in helping someone to heal, but it doesn't heal the central nervous system or the vagus nerve, and it doesn't rewire the brain. So in effect, even if somebody say please forgive me, though that helps, it wouldn't heal somebody. So that's where the work of healing is vital for people who experience childhood trauma. So many times, so much is hung on the perpetrator. If they say sorry, if we confront them, if we get them to explain or to acknowledge or to validate our pain, then it's going to take it away. And it helps, but it doesn't take it all away. So my sister, who is a professional herself, said, but that's not fair, Joe. She's a dentist. She said, that's not fair, Joe, because someone comes to me and if they get wounded, I can help them and they can be healed and move forward. But somebody who experienced childhood trauma, even though the person who hurt them asked for forgiveness, that doesn't heal. And I said, no, it's not fair. And that's why we encourage people to get help and don't delay getting help. Because I said it's not so easy, and we're talking about mental health today. It's not so easy to heal from a breakdown, and to recover from depression and anxiety. It's not so easy to heal when you have psychosis and when you're hallucinating, and you have schizophrenia. And living with diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health conditions is challenging, not only for the person who is experiencing it, but also for the family members who are doing the support. So what I find most challenging in the Christian community is blame is leveled at people. The feeling that we shouldn't have mental health problems, and the struggle for people to accept their reality and get help because of how we view mental health in the Christian community. And so the sermons and talks that blame people for their diagnosis, and the shame that individuals and families have lived with because they are made to see their illness as a sin and not a real problem. They're made to believe that more prayer and more faith could help them get well. And the fact that they aren't means something is wrong. We send this message to the detriment of other people and their spiritual lives, and confuse young people about God's love and grace. A couple of years ago, we lost a dear friend. She was more like a sister than a friend to both me and myself and my husband. And she was auntie to my children from before they were born. And so they all knew her. And she was healthy. We are plant-based and have been for many years. There's something passing. And have been for many years. But when she came to my house, She would take her own food. That's how healthy she was. But she became ill, and a couple of years ago, she died from cancer. And in the midst of our grief, our children wanted to know how come the health message didn't work, they say. And that's when we realized that there's a narrative that needs fixing. God didn't promise us immortal life here. And He didn't promise us that we wouldn't get ill mentally and physically. And He didn't say that, if you follow this path laid out for you, nothing would be wrong. We live in a world of sin. If we're faithful, eternal life is promised through Jesus. How then can we imply that mental health is a product of a distance from God? Mental health at the intersection of faith is where God asked me to work. And so I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm really glad. I'm always happy when mental health is on the agenda. So I'd like to share my screen if we can, so I can go into, we're going to talk about, how do I share my screen? We're going to talk about the adverse childhood experience. Toggle. Right. We're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences and just what is it? How do I know if you're seeing me still or if you're seeing my screen? I don't know anything about this platform. So I just let me know if you can see my screen. Awesome, wonderful. So we're going to talk about the impact of childhood trauma on mental health. And I'm going to talk about the adverse childhood experiences and what that is. What is adverse childhood experience and what is childhood trauma? So the adverse childhood experience is an acronym for, ACE rather, is an acronym for adverse childhood experiences. And it originated in a groundbreaking study that was done in 1995 in the US by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente Healthcare in California. And this has been adopted in many countries in the world. Scotland wanted to be kind of like a place where they had this massive conference about 5 years ago when they brought Nadine Burke Harris, and she is one of the women who are championing adverse childhood experiences so that we can have more understanding of how to work with people who have experienced childhood trauma and just the impact on that, on vulnerabilities across a lifetime. So ACE is common even among the middle class population. And so sometimes, again, it might be like, that can't happen to us or it won't happen to us because we are whatever we are. But it's common even in the middle class population. More than 2/3 report at least one adverse childhood experience or one incidence of childhood trauma. And I'm going to go some more into some of the areas that the research looked at and how the impact of that. And nearly a quarter experienced 3 or more. And there's a correlation between childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and there's a greater chance of experiencing poor outcomes in life across a lifetime and sometimes a generation. The slides are not moving. That's okay. Yes. Not yet. So, and there increased risks of things like heart disease, obesity, depression, substance use, and poor academic achievements. And people who experience, according to the research, 4 or more ACEs died 20 years earlier than everybody else. And that's when God said, that's where I want you to work. I'd like to start with this quote, and I want us to really pay attention as we talk about, I'm going to talk about the intersection and what can we do as a church and as a community, and how what we know can help us to heal and help other people to heal. And there's a quote from Ministry of Healing that says, "The gospel is a wonderful simplifier of life's problems. Its instructions heeded would make plain many a perplexity and save us from many an error." Now, mental health, I don't want you to see it as an error, but what I want you to see is how the gospel can simplify life's problems and how it can help us when we've experienced ACE, when we can understand how to work with people, young people, children, and ourselves when we've experienced ACEs, and how we can help limit the instances of stress in our lives and how it affects our bodies. Now, Isaiah 58 verse 12 say, "Those among you shall build up the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach and the restorer of streets to dwell in." So those of us who are listening, who we can identify, we've not experienced not even one instance of childhood trauma, then it would be really helpful that those of us who have done it and have healed, and those of us who haven't, we have this amazing job that we can do to help others by being a restorer and a bridge so that we can help repair and help those people who have experienced trauma. So what is childhood trauma? ACEs, as I said, are highly stressful and potentially traumatic events or situations that occur during childhood. And they can be a single event or prolonged threats to breaches of young person's safety, security, trust, or bodily integrity. And if we think about different stages of biological development in children, so 0 to 7, the brain is developing. It's this amazing stage of development neurologically. And then but we know that research is showing that the brain doesn't stop develop at 0 to 7 or even up to 18. We know that the brain is still developing up to 25. So if we think about highly stressful and potentially traumatic events that occur during childhood, and how do we classify that, and what's going on in the brain, what's going on in the body, what's happening for that individual as they're experiencing these traumatic events. And that's why they're so dangerous. So ACEs are physical abuse, sexual abuse, and that's the range of sexual abuse, whatever form it takes. Emotional abuse, living with someone who abused drugs, living with someone who abused alcohol, exposure to domestic violence. So living in a home where there's domestic violence or being exposed to domestic violence is considered trauma for a child. Living with someone who has gone to prison, or living with someone with mental health problems, whether that's diagnosed or undiagnosed. I get to see a slideshow. I thought it was a slideshow. I'm not sure what else to do. So if you can give me some more information about how to make this a slideshow. I'm going to continue until you tell me what to do, lady. So living with someone who has gone to prison, someone who has mental illness, or parental separation or divorce is also considered traumatic for a child. Tell me some more about what you want me to do, lady, and I'll see if I can manage that. Okay. In a research that was published in 2016, and that was done in the UK, almost half of the participants had suffered at least one ACE, and 8.3% had suffered 4 or more. And I just said earlier that people who experience 4 or more are, at so much more greater risk than the person who experienced 1 or none. So what are the impact of ACEs? How does it impact our lives? We saw some in the video that was shown earlier. But I'm going to talk through some other ways that it affects us. So it's an inability to recognize and manage emotions when we are living with so much stress, so much traumatic stress. People find it difficult to regulate emotions. The brain is, we're not living in the frontal lobe, we're living more in the emotional brain where all the traumatic memories are stored, and our nervous system is not regulated. We're not in a place of peace. And so there's an inability to manage emotions because oftentimes we don't understand what's going on. And because we don't often talk about the connection between the mind and the body, we don't know what's happening. And somebody described it for me this week as like a wave. They said that, and it's building from my tummy and it overtakes me, and I don't know, and I can't manage myself. And so people who experience traumatic childhood have an inability to recognize and manage emotions. And so we might, if you think of a child, we might want them to do something, but they can't do it. Like if you say to a child in church who seems like they're misbehaving, or a young person, you say, oh, sit down and just be quiet. They can sit, but they're not going to be able to hear anything because they're in their stress response, and they can't manage emotions. So they might cry or they might sit still because they're in their freeze response, but they're not hearing a thing. Can't hear it because our frontal lobe at those times are not accessible, are not available to us. And so also there's an inability to maintain healthy relationships. As we see in the video, which was a really good demonstration of that, where we live with such hypervigilance that what might appear normal invitation to friendships for one might seem like a threat to somebody else. At the bottom right on the corner, there is an icon that looks like a TV. Not on mine. So I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to see if I can do what the lady's asking me. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm understanding play from this current slideshow. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the ladies. So can you see my screen or not? Or you can't see my screen? Let me know if you can see my screen or not, because I think I thought I had it on slideshow. It was on slideshow. It was on slideshow. You can see my screen. Right. It was on slideshow, but I am seeing it as slideshow. I'm not sure what you're seeing. I'm not sure what you're seeing it as. Okay, is my camera on?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Right. So does that mean I can't share my screen? Right, but my presentation is on my screen. Okay, can you see me?
Yes, you can.
You can see me, right? So I'm just going to continue then without the screen share, because if one and it's so useful for people because it helps them. But never mind, I'll continue. All right. Sorry for that disruption. With the technology sometimes does what it wants. So I'm talking about an inability to recognize and manage emotions as an impact of adverse childhood experiences when we've experienced childhood trauma. Difficulty regulating feelings, difficulty understanding, recognizing and managing emotions, because sometimes we don't have a name for what's going on. We don't know how to name it, and we are often emotions are often seen sometimes as negative. Emotions like anger, frustration, or upset is seen as negative, and so what people often learn to do is to push it down as opposed to being with it and learning to understand it and learning to understand what it's telling us and how we can work with it to help ourselves to heal. There's an inability to maintain healthy relationships because, again, cues are not seen because of hypervigilance and living in the stress response. When you're living with conflict, for example, a person that might grow up in an abusive environment, they might be physical abused, or they grew up seeing their a parent being abused. For them, any somebody might playfully punch them on the arm, or as an invitation to play, but they don't experience it as an invitation to play. It might seem like a threat. And so you might find two young people at church fighting, or in the car park fighting, or whatever. And we might see it as, we might apportion blame as opposed to just learn how to understand what might be going on for that child, right? And so there's also difficulty with self and others. It really has an adverse impact on how we see ourselves. Self-worth, esteem, confidence, and confidence and things like that is really greatly impacted. So research shows that there's a strong correlation between childhood trauma and adult mental health and well-being. So I want to also separate between mental health when we have a diagnosed mental health problem, or well-being, because there are people, though they don't have a diagnosis, struggle with day-to-day living. And sometimes we don't go get help. I believe everybody needs a counselor, not only because I'm one, but because I know the benefits of it. Or if we lived in a society like it was before, where you can talk to somebody over the garden fence, where where there's a strong sense of community, where we can talk together and laugh together and cry together, I mean, we've just come out of a traumatic 2 years with COVID, with lockdown, with we weren't able to grieve the way we usually grieve. So when somebody, one of us loses a family or a friend, we used to get together in the house and sing and pray and cry and laugh and if you're Jamaican, drink chocolate tea and eat fish and bread. But you can't do that. We didn't get to do that for 2 years. And so we were grieving alone, and that's traumatic. That's a lot of trauma that we've had to live with. That's a lot of pain that we've had to live with. And so those rituals that are very important in helping us to externalize and to release didn't happen. So a lot of people, what we're finding is that in the next couple of years, mental health is going to be even worse than it is now because of COVID. And we know that from research that mine did, that mental health in the Afro-Caribbean community is going to be even more increased than in other communities due to COVID. So when we're talking about mental health and adverse childhood experiences, if you've experienced childhood trauma and you've unprocessed stuff, and then there's the pandemic on top of it, then I really that's why series like this are so important, because the information that you're getting is really vital. Don't dismiss it. Don't go home and only say, I'm going to pray about it. Prayer is amazing because God is amazing, but He gives us wisdom and He wants us to be wise. And He wants us, because if you have persistent headaches, or if you know that there was you, because of family vulnerabilities in your family, was at a higher risk of having diabetes or certain type of cancers, you would change your lifestyle. You would do something different. So I really want to encourage you that if you're here and you see yourself in any one of these ACEs that we've talked about, that you would please don't hesitate in going to get support. Get some support. So just on the impact of ACEs again, and the distinction between adult mental health and well-being, that there might be somebody who has depression, but it's not acute. It's not at a manic phase. So they're managing to do the bare minimum. They're managing to go to work, and they're managing to pay their bills, sometimes not on time. They're managing to get dressed and feed the children, but it's a struggle. Day-to-day life is a struggle. And there are many, 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 many people like that. That is just, life is just not as, and I'm not even going to think, not even easy, but just life is not as it would be, as they wanted to. So there's a struggle. So enduring mental health and a struggle to manage general well-being is what we're talking about. This the correlation between enduring mental health. So somebody with a diagnosis of, say, psychosis or depression or anxiety, or depression and anxiety, somebody who hallucinates, and somebody who struggles to manage day-to-day life. So some of the impact of adverse childhood experiences on mental health. Some of ACE is associated with things like depression. So people who experience adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma, are twice more likely to have depression and anxiety, 2 times more likely than somebody who hasn't. They have panic reactions. So people struggle with panic attacks, hallucinations, there's psychosis, and there's a greater risk of suicidal ideation. And we know suicide among men is really high, women too, but men around the middle of their lives, the 30s, 40s, really high risk times for men. And so we need to have conversations that are open and honest, create spaces where people can come and talk about the challenges that they're experiencing. I know men struggle with talking about feelings, understanding feelings, talking about feelings. A woman is more likely to attend a group. I run groups for women who experience sexual abuse, and we're on our third round. I tried to do it with men, and I had two come forward. It's harder for a man to want to talk about the impact of physical abuse, the impact of sexual abuse. It's harder for a man to talk about what's it like growing up in a home where there was domestic violence, or the person who went to prison, or living with substance use. All the things that we know through the research. It's not as easy. but it doesn't mean that they're impacted any less. And I know that when we add the religious piece to it, it makes it even harder because there's so much pressure. There's so much pressure on us to be okay and to be spiritual enough to not have depression. And it's not because you're not spiritual why you have depression or why you have anxiety or why you hallucinate or why you have psychosis. It has nothing to do with it. Why you have suicidal thoughts. It's not because you don't love the Lord. But when you live in with traumatic stress and a dysregulated nervous system, and you're living in the emotional brain more than your frontal lobe because of the trauma, then it's not a choice. We're not making a choice. People are not making a choice. People are really struggling and suffering. And we need to have solutions for people as opposed to let them believe that something is wrong with them and that's why they have they're experiencing what they're experiencing. So if you could see my screen, you'd see the image of a brain. So if you just view that with me with your mind's eye, the brain is the capital of the body, and it's the seat of all the nervous forces and mental action. The nerves proceeding from the brain control the body. So we know that the spinal cord is connected to the brain, connected to all of our organs. So that's why mental health and even looking at childhood trauma is not just a psychological thing. We have to look at the whole person. When we're given solutions, give solutions for the whole being. When I'm teaching someone to regulate, I'm not saying think positively because that's just one part. And when somebody is triggered and you're living with traumatic stress because of trauma, thinking positively is the end result. We have to learn how to regulate our bodies, learn how to regulate our nervous system in order to have access to our frontal lobe to think positively. You see, there's a whole chain of things that is going on. So, but by the brain nerves, mental impressions are conveyed to all the nerves of the body as by telegraph wires, and they control the vital action of every part of the system. And there's a quote that I love from the and I'm reading it. What I'm reading now is from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4. All the organs of motion are governed by the communications they receive from the brain. So that's just the correlation, the connection between the brain and the body. And there's a quote that I love, and I think it's in Gospel Workers, that says the brain nerves that connect with the entire system is the only avenue through which heaven communicates with man and affects his innermost life. When I sit with that quote, it tells me, because I know what happens when somebody is triggered, when somebody experiences trauma and they're triggered, they're in their stress response, they're in the emotional brain, and the frontal lobe is offline at that time. And I know the Bible tells us that we must be sober and vigilant. And I know that when we're there, we're not sober because we're in the emotional brain, and it's not a choice because it takes milliseconds to move from trigger to automatic response. And I hear that the brain nerves, we need to keep that clear so heaven can communicate with us. And so that's why healing and even managing our mental health and our well-being, it's not just a psychological thing, because when that's happening, we don't have, our frontal lobe is not online. So there are certain triggers that we have long-term, long after trauma has passed. At the slightest hint of danger, the brain mobilizes brain circuits and secretes stress hormones long after. Talking about people who experience trauma when they were 3 and now they're 53. It's the same traumatic response. We don't choose our traumatic responses. It's developed through the trauma that we experience, through our lived experiences. And triggers can be overwhelming and you can feel out of control. And that's why sometimes people who experience trauma will say things like, I feel damaged to the core, you know? And when we're thinking about developmental trauma, when people who experience it in those early developmental years, it can feel like that. I mean, trauma survivors often, that's how they often describe their experiences. So who are these people? As I said earlier, that when the research was done, it was done with middle-class white people, for want of, a better way to explain it. So sometimes we hear these reports and we hear about adverse childhood experiences and we hear about trauma. And sometimes we think about a certain percentage of the population. It could be anyone. We know that one in three, 1 in 3 people experience sexual trauma. 1 in 3. 1 in 4 knows somebody who has. 1 in 6 men have experienced sexual trauma. So we know through research that is a huge percentage of the church that we're sitting in. The person on our right and on our left every Sabbath could experience childhood trauma, or it could be us. So it could be anyone, and there's no way to spot someone based on their how they relate, how they communicate. Well, we can't. When you know how to spot it, you can. But I mean, looking on, it doesn't dress a certain way, it doesn't look a certain way. It's not represented through education or lack of education or job or the car you drive or the house that you live in, the part of town that you live in. It doesn't. It's just anybody. If anything, what we know is that sometimes people use upward mobility, academics, striving to achieve as a coping mechanism. So sometimes the person, with high academic achievements could also experience trauma. So trauma can happen to anyone. Through the research done by the Center for Disease Control, we know 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested. We know that it's a similar situation for us here in the UK. 1 in 4 was physically abused. 1 in 3 couples engage in physical violence. Every week, 2 women die from physical violence. So you can think of the homes and the children in those homes. 1 in 4 grew up with an alcohol relatives, and 1 in 8 grew up in a home with violence. So it's a massive percentage of the population. So, and that's why I like to start with the gospel is a wonderful simplifier of life's problems, because I believe that at this intersection that we have a great work that we can do in restoring and repairing and helping people who have experienced trauma to heal, and being a loving, safe place for people with mental health, whether they're enduring mental health problems or whether they're just struggling to cope and their well-being is not great. Trauma leaves traces on our minds and our emotions, and it influences our capacity for joy and connection. And it can affect our immune system. And so I won't talk about the immune system and the body part of it because we're sticking with the mental health. But what I will say here is that we often do programs and things about how to look after ourselves mentally, like physically rather. But we ignore the brain and the foods that are good for the brain, some of the things that we can do to have more access to our frontal lobe, and the things that we can do to stay emotionally healthy, what we can do to manage our emotions, and how we can help somebody who struggles with anger, that we don't isolate them, but we help them to understand. We direct them to support them as they access support, to understand what's the root of their anger, to not shun the person with depression because it's not going, because we think if they came to Bible class and if they attend Sabbath school and if they study prophecy and if they do all the things that we think they should do, that their depression would go. That some people will live with depression. Some people live with anxiety. Some people will live with, anxiety and depression. And how can we help them? How can we be comfortable with just that this person has psychosis and they come to church? How can we not see them as somebody that we need to shun? How can we love them? How can we do what Isaiah 58 says, that we need to be repairer of the breach and restore our paths to dwell in? How can we be an environment and a place where that can happen? And next weekend, I'm training master guides in adverse childhood experiences and working with children and young people, I'm really glad that the church is doing that, because we need to learn how to be a place where if we don't have mental health, how do we help someone with mental health? I grew up with an uncle with psychosis, but I still didn't understand it. I didn't know what to do. He is integrated into our family and into our community, but he's kind of on the edges of it. As I look back now, as an adult, having better understanding of mental health, he's kind of on the edges. You talk to him, but not really, he's not as integrated as, because we don't know enough, and we don't know as much as he's a part of, he's still not included. So what are the things that we can do And if you're here and you're a family member of somebody who is struggling with any mental health condition, just know that there's no shame. I know there's a lot of stigma attached to mental health, but when we understand the underlying causes, then we can work with those. We can work with those, and we can learn how to be more compassionate. We can learn how to be more compassionate to people. So also, even those who witness trauma is affected by it. So it's not just the person who experienced it, but the person who witnessed it can also it can also have an impact. So we're talking about mental health and adverse childhood experiences, and we talk about the fact that one of the 10 areas that was studied through the research done in 1995 is parental separation or divorce, right? So what does your parents' divorce have to do with your health, your mental health? How does that affect your mental health? Your parents separated when you were 5, 10, 3, 15. How does it affect your mental health when you're 35, when you're 25? So we know that affect, childhood trauma affects health across generations, across a lifetime. We're vulnerable even if your mother was pregnant with you when the divorce happened, or when the abuse was occurring, or when the substance use was occurring, because things are passed on through, genetically. And so incidents in childhood records, if events that have an emotional connection gets recorded in the brain, and so that record stays. And every time there is something that happens that triggers a response, we're experiencing it as if we were there in that moment, right there in that moment. um and please, when this is over, take some time and read some more about the adverse childhood experiences. One book I'd recommend is Nadine Burke's Aries, The Deepest Well. Beautiful. And she has a TED talk as well. So our parents' divorce when we were 5, when we were 3, still impacts us as adults, because it develops a stress response. The abuse that occur in childhood, the substance use that we lived with. When I when I was trained as a social worker, I trained as a social worker first. And when I was training, I used to work with children whose parents had substance use problems. And I never forget one young girl I was working with. She was about 10. And she said, I enjoyed school. She enjoyed school. And she said, but I would always start worrying after lunchtime. After lunchtime was when she started wondering, who is picking me up today? And if mom is picking me up today, is she going to be drunk? Every day after lunchtime, this young girl lives in her stress response. She's continually in the fight or flight response. She's trying to focus at school. Of course, that's not possible, but she's living with this. Now, she grows up to be 20, 25. She will continue living that stress response, but through the fear that was created. So one of these responses doesn't just dissolve, it gets stored in our system, it gets stored in our brain, and the body remembers those responses. So we shut down our bodies because it doesn't feel safe. The constant stress is too much, and we grow and continue to use the responses. The chaos of hurt and trauma cannot get out, and so illness is the result. Illness is the result, and people cope in a variety of ways. We develop addictions, different types of addictions. The depression gets worse. And as I said, through the adverse childhood experience research, we know that people who experience childhood trauma are twice more likely to develop heart disease, rather than 3 times as likely to suffer depression. And we have a 20-year lower life expectancy. Depression, anxiety, as I said, psychosis, hallucination, and all of those kind of issues we are more vulnerable to. And children who grew up in these homes grow up with insecurity, develop anxiousness, depression, anxiety, and the list goes on, as I'd explained earlier. So what's the solution? When we have these kinds of experiences, what's the solution? How do we grow through them? When I'm doing an assessment, I'm going to go back to the my screen. when I'm doing an assessment, an early assessment with anyone who comes to counseling, I do an adverse childhood experience questionnaire just to see what we're working with, to see the traumas that we're working with, and to look at the impacts of them, and to use that as a framework to work from. How can we help somebody who is diagnosed with depression? I know lots of people struggle, they don't want to take medication because of what we learn about it. But I always say, if you have depression, if you have any mental health problems, or if you have any family member with mental health, it's really important to do something. We can't do nothing. When you have a mental health problem, diagnosed or undiagnosed, you might just suspect. It's really important to do something. If you're not taking medication, then you're going to need to go hard on the lifestyle choices. Dr. Nedley's Depression Recovery Program works with everything except schizophrenia and psychosis, and is really, really effective. So something has to be done, because depression don't just go away, especially if you're bipolar, or if you have severe depression and anxiety. It just won't go away because we want it to, and we can't pray it away. We really have to do something. And on prayer, and I know I'm speaking to people who are Christian and believers. And when I say we can't pray to it, doesn't mean that God is not able. God can do impossible things, and I see Him do it every single day with people who desire it. And that's just one way of packaging that. But I know that there is human effort and divine intervention. I know we have to do something. If you've been diagnosed with heart disease or diabetes, you're not going to do anything. You're going to do something about it. You're going to see your doctor regularly. You're going to do regular blood tests. You're going to do regular checks to see even the lifestyle changes that you're making. You're going to see how that is impacting you. So it's really important, if it's a diagnosed mental health problems, and that you get support. I know that our mental health, the NHS is overrun, understaffed, underfunded, under everything, and it might be a struggle. You might have to get support. You might have to pay for support. You might have to, but it's really important that first, go speak to your GP, ask for an assessment, and take it from there. If you've already and you're living with a mental health problem, if you're a family member that's supporting someone with a mental health problem, I'd suggest getting support for yourself as well, because it can be a long journey, it can be a long road. And I want to say that I hope that through these programs that the church is doing, that we can begin to dismantle the stigma, get rid of the shame, so we can work together in learning how to love and support each other despite the diagnosis, whatever it is, whether it's mental or physical. Okay. If there's any questions, I'm not seeing anyone, and I'm not seeing a chat, so I don't know if there's anybody that asks any questions, or if there's any comments, then we can do that now.
So we've had one question so far. The question we have is, how can we positively discipline our children so that it does not impact the child's mental health?
I love questions about discipline, because I think go to the behavior first. The behavior tells us a story. And when we look at the video earlier, that video that the lady shows, which is really good, the first part of the video, that young man pushed the guy in the pool, and they were fighting. The coach called him out the pool, sent him away, and that had an impact, because he responded because of his stress response, because he's hypervigilant, because he's hypervigilant to threats, and because of the trauma, he's not able to read social cues, and so he didn't know that he was playing with him. He thought he was trying to drown him, so he responded like that. because the coach perhaps have a framework of working with trauma, when we see the clip again, what she did something different that time, which had a different impact. So we need to see the behavior in a broader context, in a broader view. We need to expand the lens a little bit and look at what is going on, what is happening, what is this behavior, what's the root of the behavior, and that will give us an idea of how we manage the behavior, right? So positively disciplining means understanding what's happening, understanding the trigger for that response, and working with not the behavior but the root of it. So that's what I say. I'm a mom. I understand. I have teenagers and I have a preteen. Life at home is interesting, right? But the best parenting advice I've ever had was given to me by God, and He said, I was complaining about the children one day, and He says, Joanna, in those moments when you want them to surrender their hearts to you, yours is not surrendered to me. If you want them to surrender to me first. And I can tell you that changed our parenting completely years ago. Surrender, like, God, what's going on? Why are they responding like that? And He will give you an insight, and He will also work with the child. So, the end result is discipline, and we can hit, and we can put time out, and we can do all of these things. And the child is trying to communicate with us through their actions, and we're missing the signals altogether. So in what's best for your child, get to know them, study them, get to understand them. Last night, we don't like the children having gadgets late at night and all that, and it's Friday night and we want to go to bed. And I went to check on my daughter, and I said, what did you say? She says, oh, I'm just listening to a story. And I left the room, and then I heard something. I thought, what's that? And she felt guilty because she wasn't listening to a story. I thought, and the Lord said, go and pray with her. Go and pray with her and tell her it's okay. She didn't overcome that time, but pray with her, and it will have a different result. And the Lord softened my heart. And I went in there and I said, you didn't overcome, did you? And she said, no, I didn't. And I said, do you want me to pray with you? We prayed together. And she said, thank you, Mommy. And we left. And I went to bed better. She went to bed better. So what I'd say is listen to the Holy Spirit, because He wants to partner with us in parenting. Because His goal, I have a goal for my family. Like, we're going to stay connected, whatever, however, whatever happened and we have to do the repair work, we're going to stay connected. I'm not going to wound their heart. We're going to be connected. God's aim is to save our children. And so we need to partner with Him. Whatever the behavior, He will help us understand the root of the behavior. Deal with the root. Don't deal with the fruit. The behavior is often the fruit. And I know I've kind of took long with that one, but because I know it's so important. The fruit is the behavior. There's a root. Find the root, and you'll be able to fix the fruit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for answering that question, Joanna. It doesn't look like we have any other questions at the moment. Was there anything else you'd like to add for the rest of the program?
I can't hear. I can't hear.
You can't hear me.
No, I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was just saying it doesn't look like we have any other questions at the moment. I was just going to ask if there's anything else you wanted to add before we close.
I mean, just to encourage everyone that mental health, what I wanted to do was just normalize it. That it's not anything to be afraid of. It's a result of sin, in that we live in a sinful world, but it's not anything to be afraid of. It's not anything to be ashamed of. It's something that God wants us to be able to work with. There are many people that struggle with it, that have to have medication or change lifestyle or just living day to day, and it doesn't hamper us living and having a full life. So I want us to see it in that light, so that we can live with and minister to and work with people with mental health just as much as we do with anyone else.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'd just like to thank you, Joanna, for taking your time this afternoon. That was such an insightful program, so much to learn from that program. And like you said, I think it's really important that within our church community, we do normalize these conversations so that we can support everyone in the church and give them the support that they need, and even just the understanding. So that's really, really, really important. I'd just like to pray to close. So I'll just pray it now. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, welcome to afternoon. Thank you for has been this afternoon, and we just through some of the topics that have been discussed, that we may be able to increase our knowledge, Lord, that we may be able to support those around us, and also being able to seek out help when necessary, but ultimately leaning on you and trusting that you will lead and guide us, Lord, and that help us with our mental health as well. You may be able to spread your good word as well out there to everybody else. I thank you for also allowing Joanna to lead out this, and I just pray that you may continue to bless her as well in her ministry. And we'd just like to thank you again for allowing this program to take place. Pray these things in Jesus' name I pray, amen. I'd also just like to thank everyone that tuned in this afternoon, and a real big thank you to the media team. Despite some of our difficulties, they've been really supportive with the program this evening. I pray that you all have a blessed week, and hopefully all tune in to the next part of awareness series. A topic, but hopefully as well we'll get some gems from that. So thank you all once again for tuning in. I just pray that you have a lovely evening. Thank you.
For your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. 'Cause all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness